I just recently got into audiobooks.
Oh.
Yeah, so I did not. I do need a paperback. I am going to get a hard copy because, as you can see from your first book, it's worn because I was all in this book because this is literally one of my favorite books of all time. It's the top five, and it's not five. So, yeah. So but I just in the interest of expediency, I got into audiobooks, especially when I have people on the podcast who have books.
Yeah.
They're a way for me to just like go ahead because it's hard for me not to read somebody's book that is going to be on, my show. So, Jennifer Lewis, her book was the first audiobook I ever listened to, and she did it herself. And man, that was like a tremendous experience because she's like such a great actress. And then after that, and I was like, I'm gonna see how this audiobook goes. So, so yours was next. So I was just like, all right, I want the hard copy of this book, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna do the audiobook of it. I was just curious, did they ask you to do your own audiobook? Did you not want to?
They always give the author the option, but I really truly believe that people who work really hard at what they do and are really good at it should be the ones to do what they do. And there are there really are some amazing people. This is all that they do. This is the living. This is how they make their living. And they win awards for it. It's a whole other ecosystem. I really wanted someone who was like a professional to read this book. And Robin Miles, who is amazing. She's unbelievable. She's so incredible. She did the audio for The Warmth of the Suns. And I would hear from people all the time. They were saying, the audio is amazing for The Warmth of the Suns. And so I wanted the consistency, and she is who I wanted to read this book. I think she does an amazing job.
Did you at least get to pick like who would do it?
Yeah. I asked her because she did such a great job with Warmth of the Suns. And I got such good response from it because it really makes a difference, how you feel, how you absorb a book. It can make a difference who is the one narrating it. And she just feels it. I don't know. She just does an amazing job. I remember first hearing when the Warmth of the Suns audio arrived to me, and, I listened, and I was mesmerized. I mean, I knew how the story went, because I wrote it, and I still found myself, just like pulled in. So the audio is a really significant format for for absorbing a book nowadays. So no, I'm so glad you read it that way. People often they will get the audio and then read along. I mean, the way people are engaging with work in our current era, like they might have the Kindle and they follow along with the audio, or they might have the hardcover and follow along with audio. And what I love about audio too is it allows people to have like the whole family involved if they choose to. So it can be communal. It's like binge watching, but you're binge listening.
Well, now you got me curious as what the audio sounds like for Warmth of Other Suns, because I just read it. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Because I was speaking of audio, like 1619 Project, I'd listened to the podcast. I saw the multimedia project, but I listened to it. It's a phenomenal listen as a podcast.
When it's done well, I feel like to tell you the truth, I mean, the whole, what you're doing and podcasting in general has such high production values now and people are taking it so seriously. And it's also so intimate, it's like, it's a sharing, it's a conversation. And I actually wonder, this is just my theory, that in the era of COVID-19, where people are so isolated from their normal, circle and lives. I think that, the intimacy of hearing a voice that's well spoken, that's coming to you and that's familiar has real power. It really does.
So, Isabel, I've come up with a nickname for you. I call you the Sade of nonfiction, right? Because I'm a big Sade fan, and everybody who is a big Sade fan knows that Sade, she will just drop one on us, and she'll hide in the shadows. She'll be somewhere deep in the cut, and then it's like, boom, take this fire. And so I feel like you do that to us, because Warmth of the Suns dropped, and then, what is it, 2010? That's when Warmth of the Suns dropped. And then now in 2020, you like, tell you what, y'all ain't ready. Caste, got you. So I was like, she is literally the Sade of nonfiction. Yeah, that is a true compliment, definitely. I appreciate every guest that I have on this podcast, but you are in a special category because I feel like I'm going to spend this entire podcast literally fawning over you because I'm just so amazed, impressed, just inspired by your utter brilliance. I say this repeatedly whenever I'm asked about the best books I've ever read. I can promise you Warmth of Other Suns is always one of the first books out of my mouth. Like, best book on race I've ever read. Easy to say it was your first book. And now I'm mad at you because after reading Caste, I'm like, can I still say that because of the brilliance of Caste? So I say all that to say is that welcome and thank you so much for joining me on this. I really appreciate it. Yeah. So let's dive in. Caste is your second offering. You write very brilliantly about race, but not, I hate saying about race because it's not about necessarily race. You're writing about caste, hence the title. Before we get into the discussion about the book and how you put it together and all those other good things, can you explain for the audience what exactly is caste?
Well, caste is a different way of looking at our country. It's an artificial, arbitrary, graded ranking of human value in a society. And that graded ranking or hierarchy is what determines a person's standing, levels of respect, benefit of the doubt accorded to a person or a group, or withdrawn from a person or a group, access to resources or lack thereof, assumptions of intelligence, competence, beauty even, through no fault or action of one's own, because in a hierarchy such as ours, you are born to what has been a group that was assigned a particular value going back for centuries and generations. And so you're not having to do anything, you're born into it. And so it's basically a graded ranking of humanity in a hierarchy that creates a hierarchy that then determines so much of one's life, not everything, but so much of one's life when you just come into the world.
Now, you, with Warmth of Other Suns, your first book, I think it took, was it 15 years to write? Okay. All right. That was quite a journey. I know you did more than 1,200 interviews for that, because I believe you either said or I read somewhere where you said you stopped counting at 1,200, correct?
Well, no, that was actually an audition for people to be the protagonist in the book. Essentially, it was like a casting call. And that was why I'm talking to as many people as I did for that book.
So a lot of painstaking care was put into Warmth of Other Suns, and then now 10 years later, you have Caste. So describe what the process was like in putting together Caste, say, and the differences versus how you put together Warmth of Other Suns.
Well, it's interesting that you ask it in that way because one leads to the other. I mean, without Warmth of the Suns, there wouldn't be this new book, Caste. It was through the Warmth of the Suns that I came to become aware of the idea of caste and began using the word. In the Warmth of the Suns, the word racism is not used. That's not to say that it doesn't exist and it doesn't need to be constantly interrogated, considered, and still fought. It's just that it was not the comprehensive, all-encompassing word that was necessary to describe what people had to endure during the Jim Crow caste system, the Jim Crow system, as it was known then. And so I found that, as I was discovering things to try to tell the story of 6 million people fleeing or defecting Jim Crow, I had to really go deep in understanding what their lives was like to recreate it for the reader. And, I had no idea that that in Birmingham it was against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together was against the law. You could go to jail.
Well, that's, it is hard to, I see them almost as twin books in many respects. And I think that's pretty much how you described it. But when you were doing Warmth of Other Suns, or before you did that one, like, what was the thought bubble that made you want to look at our society, the prism of race, through the Great Migration? How did that idea blossom?
Yeah, well, if you are African American, raised outside of the South, you are very likely, assuming that if your people did not come from, say, the Caribbean or from the continent, then you are very likely a product of the Great Migration. I'm a product of the Great Migration. Most people that I, grew up around in Washington, D.C. was where I grew up. And then as I've traveled around the country as a correspondent for the New York Times, I would run into people. If I was in Chicago, if I was in LA, Detroit, wherever I was, it was everywhere. I mean, this is literally how African Americans became a people spread out throughout the country. It's how African Americans actually became urban. We just take for granted that, you think of cities and you think of African Americans, but that wasn't the way it was for the vast majority of time that we've been in this country. I mean, for the vast majority of time, from 1619 until the Great Migration, African Americans were primarily a rural people. They were Southern people. 90% of all African Americans were living in the South before the Great Migration began. So it's fairly new, in terms of long history. But because it's so much a part of just how things are now for, people alive today, or even, just only not that many decades ago, we just take for granted that that's how it's always been. But that if you talk to somebody long enough who's, living in Detroit, African American, in Detroit for a couple of generations, you talk to them long enough and you're going to get back to Alabama. You're going to get back to Mississippi. You're going to get back to Arkansas. I mean, that's the way that it is. I mean, that's how everyone was spread out. That's the, internal diaspora that happened in our country's history not that long ago. And so as I was, becoming more aware of that, as a journalist interviewing lots of people in Chicago in particular, and then recognizing that it was a different stream where I grew up, I just was stunned that there wasn't more written about it. I just, it was this, it's this sea change. It's this, the magnitude of what that means to have almost an entire people relocated to the rest of the country, and thus truly becoming American in the sense of geographically, is so massive. And yet there was very little that was really written about it, particularly from the perspective of the people who had lived it. So I just, I felt that was the one thing that I wanted to do. It was like the only thing, it was like this big open puzzle that was right there in front of everyone's eyes, and we weren't really talking about it. And so that's why I started a view. And the more I look and the more people I talk to, the more fascinating it was for me, and the more massive. There was just a watershed and not just African American history, but in our country's history.
So when the book was published, what were your notions about how it might be received?
I did not know. I mean, I just wanted to get it done. It was 15 years. I often say that if it was a human being, it would be in high school and dating. That's how long it took me to finish that book. So, so I just was so happy to have it done. And, the main response that I would get wherever I would go was people would say, no matter what their background, no matter what their age was, they would say, I had no idea. It was stunning to me that people who lived through that era would say, I had no idea. Because, generally speaking, people who had endured it and survived Jim Crow weren't talking about it. In fact, that's one of the challenges in even doing a book of that kind, talking to people who had lived through it. And people, many people that I would talk to since then, at these events I might do, people come up to me and say, I try to get my mother to talk about it. I try to get my grandmother to talk about it. They won't talk about it. They just don't, they just keep, they just do not want to talk about it. They don't want to go there. And it's really,
why do you think that is?
And it's universal. I mean, I hear it all the time. And I believe, after having talked to so many people and interviewed so many people who went through this, is that it's just too painful. It's like post-traumatic stress. There have been studies that have been done, or other works that have said that if you were African American in the South, into the 1960s, most people knew of someone who had been lynched. I mean, someone in the town, sometimes even a relative. Going out and talking about the War for the Sons, as I did after it came out, and even up until just the time of the COVID hit, people would tell me all kinds of stories about, how their family left, and it was an uncle who had to go because he was about to be lynched, or they knew someone in their family was lynched. So it was such a a repressive, world that many, many Americans just are not truly aware of, that they were experiencing post-traumatic stress, almost like the survivors of war and upheaval, other kinds of upheaval. And I think that they just did not want to relive that. I also think that they wanted to shield their children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren from what they had endured. And then to me, even more tragically, is I think a lot of people who survive such things, they absorb the trauma to such a degree that they begin to blame themselves. They begin to carry a kind of shame as if there is some type of stigma attached to what they had endured. And because there's very little in the way of affirmation in the rest of society for having gone through that. And so a lot of them, I think, experience a lot of shame. That to me, that's the most tragic of all, because they were born into a system, not of their own making. They had nothing to do with the creation of it. The main thing was to try to survive. And their survival alone, I think, is a reason for honoring them and respecting them and holding them with a sense of awe, really, that they could survive all that they did. So those are the reasons why I think that it just didn't get talked about.
So how soon after Warmth of Other Suns did you begin to start working on Caste?
Well, I think that it's been marinating for a very long time. I actually started talking about it more. Talking about Warmth meant I was talking about Caste. I was talking about it all the time. I was using the word Caste all the time. And then, it sort of was an evolution, because then Trayvon happened, what happened to Trayvon Martin. And that was 2012. And I think it was February 2012. And there's something about how that moment, the moment when that not only did it happen, but also the outcome of that case. I think a lot of us remember where we were when we heard, when we found, however we found out about it. And it was kind of some type of jarring into a kind of reality that you didn't want to be in. You didn't want to believe that. And I think that was one of the things that really got me thinking about how we still live under the shadow of that originating caste system. Interestingly enough, in terms of, I actually wrote a piece for the New York Times after that. And that would be what you could say the beginning of my really starting to go deep on the issue of caste. And I started out with talking about caste in that op-ed. And it's interesting that the county where Trayvon Martin was killed was the same county that one of the people in my book, George Starling, had been from. He was from the same county. And so there was this interconnectedness that seemed to be this messaging that I was supposed to be paying attention to. And that sort of one thing just led to the other. And then over time, other things continued to happen. And I just said, I have to go in and really just, stop and focus and get this done.
Because of the overwhelming success of Warmth, did that make the writing experience for Caste different? Like, I don't know if you felt any pressure. I guess that's what I'm asking. If you've had any pressure to recreate what you did the first time around.
Well, I'm a firm believer that, each of us have no competition other than ourselves. In other words, trying to be the best that you can be is the only competition we have, each of us. And so my goal was to just do the very best that I could with it. I wasn't thinking so much I don't often think about what's going to happen afterward. I mean, what the pieces I did for the Times that ended up winning a Pulitzer, I wasn't, a lot of people might think, well, were you thinking? No, I wasn't. I mean, I can't, you have no control over what's going to happen after you finish something. All you have control over is what you do with what you have in front of you. And so I really live by that, because I have no control over anything else. I felt for this second book, this pull. I felt as if it wasn't something that I even necessarily wanted to do. It's something that I felt I had to do. I feel that the phenomenon of caste, the psychology of caste, the way that caste can work on people without our realizing it, has a lot to teach us about aspects of our country or the way we interact that's seemingly nothing else would explain. And that's the reason why I felt that that I needed to get into it. So it just was, I wasn't hearing anyone else. I wasn't seeing what I thought, I was hoping maybe someone else would do something, but nobody did, so there I go into it. And so I really, you asked about the first book, I don't really think about it in that way. This is something different. It was something that I was not seeing anyone else doing. And I feel as if as long as there's something that I have that I need to say, then that's what I need to focus in on. If I don't have anything to say, I'm not saying anything. But if I have something to say, then that's when I go in and I say what I have to say.
And that's why I compared you to Sade, because she does the same thing. That is why. She's like, you know what? I don't have an album for y'all right now, but now I do. All right? I got something to say. I got a heartbreak. Let me talk about it. Right? That's how it is. So, of course, when Caste hit, it was like a lightning bolt. Oprah Winfrey made it her selection for her book club, which means like basically this is about to be a huge book. And so seeing her glowing endorsement of this book, what did that mean to you?
Well, it was just, I was out of the blue. I had, again, like I've said to you, I have no expectations. One reason why I have no expectations is because, it takes so much work to get the things that I do done. There's so much research that goes into these things. I am having to go through so much material, my own work, reading and trying to understand the, works from other disciplines, it's all, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, political science, philosophy, history, of course, all those things I am so immersed in it. And I emerge from my immersion with this, like, just so almost just, ready to just go and get it out to the world. The main thing, there's a reason that people call it delivering a manuscript, almost like you've been pregnant and you've now delivered the baby. It's sort of like that. And you're just exhausted from the process. That, I really was not, I didn't have time to think about what was going to be happening, who was going to do what. So it came out of the blue. I was just, I was stunned. I was, thrilled, of course. And then, to hear her voice over the phone, you hear the voice, it's one of the most recognizable voices in the world. And then
I was going to ask you, does Oprah sound like Oprah when she's talking on the phone?
And because of that, it's, you're still stunned. It's almost as if you have to like recover from just like the voice is coming not to the world, but to you. And so it was an out of body experience to be in that situation and to hear that this is going to be her choice. So, but so many things happen so rapidly in something like this that before you can adjust to one thing, then there's something else. And then the book came out and, now it's out in the world, now here.
But let me start on Isabel's behalf, because Oprah, that's a big endorsement, right? But it's competing with Barack Obama endorsing, when I think he said Warmth of Other Suns was like his favorite book that year, right?
Yeah.
So act like you're not used to super famous historical figures endorsing your work.
Yeah.
But just I guess to further sort of resume read, you're the first Black woman to win a Pulitzer Prize.
In journalism.
In journalism, yes, sorry. You've written this legendary work. Are there times, have you allowed yourself to reflect or at least enjoy what you've accomplished?
That's an interesting question that you ask. I don't know that I have, because I'm constantly, in the midst of doing something. The grass doesn't grow under me. I'm constantly in the process of trying to get something else done. And, after Warmth came out, for example, there was no time really to reflect because I was on the road constantly with that book. I really was on the road. Like I said, even with COVID-19, there were events I was supposed to be doing that, of course, were canceled or delayed or having to be rescheduled to who knows when. So I haven't actually done that. I don't really take the time. my focus is getting things done. It's my goal is to create and produce the work, and I mean that. I mean, I'm here for a purpose. I have a purpose here. Everyone, I hope, finds their purpose, and I know what my purpose is, and I'm trying to do my purpose. If that doesn't even, is that a phrase? I don't know.
You made it one. Who am I to question your brilliance? So yes, that is a phrase. Of course, you could not have predicted some of the events that have happened in the country this year, which has felt like for everybody the longest year of anybody's life.
And
but
over yet.
Yeah, and it's not done. Like, right, we still got months to go. I don't even. We got a huge election coming up. I don't even want to think about what the rest of this year might look like. But nevertheless, the positioning of this book coming out at this time, have you thought about how sort of divine that is? Because I guess I'm trying to figure out an articulate way to relate what you've written in Caste to what we're seeing now with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and all these names. They seem to be perfect encapsulations of what you're talking about in this book. So for those who maybe haven't read it, and even for those who have read Caste, like, how does what you talk about in the book relate to these instances of brutality that we have seen just in 2020?
To your point, I certainly, no one could have predicted the specific, things that have occurred in the last few months. I mean, we know we live under the continuing shadow of a caste system that's described in the book, but how it plays out specifically, no one can predict. I would say that I don't write for the moment. I don't write for any moment. I write with an eye toward looking at the history, an eye toward what is universal and true throughout our country's history, and really true for, sort of human nature. My bio, my avatar on social media is I write about human nature, and I mean that because I really believe that sadly a lot of things that we have seen recently are things that we have seen in some iteration before, and history that is not addressed may not repeat itself exactly, but it will reappear. And that's what I feel we're seeing. So it's a continuum. Our country's history is on a continuum. And while we make, these strides of progress, and then they are often met with resistance and sometimes outright backlash. And then there's a regression. And then there's a plateauing, and it can be a long time before the next stage of progression. So it's a back and forth, and it's all a continuum. And as long as we continue on this path where we're not really engaging, first of all, don't even know the history, to truly be on the same page as Americans about what our history is, we continue to be at odds with one another, because we're not on the same page about what even has happened. We can't go forward because we are not in agreement about what even has happened. And so as long as we're not in agreement, we don't have a collective shared narrative about our country's history, then we keep seeing this over and over again. So I'm not ever writing to a moment. I'm writing for to try to go beneath it, to try to transcend the moment so that we can get to some of the root causes that we may not be able to see, to look beyond what we think we see to what is the actual core that we are facing, even if we're not dealing with it. I describe our country as being like an old house. That's one of the metaphors. A lot of metaphors in this book, as you know, and I describe it as like an old house. And it's got the beams and the pillars and the joists that you cannot see in any building that we might live in. And then we can get distracted by what we can see, which is the walls and the paint and the wallpaper, all the things that we can see. And after rain, we may not want to go into the basement, but, if we don't go in the basement, we're going to have to deal with what's there, whether we go in there or not. We're going to have to deal with it, whether we know what's going on or not. Ignorance is no protection from one's inaction. If you do not know what's going on, you are not protected just because you don't know. You're still having to deal with it. And that's why I always I'm trying to go beneath what we think we can see so that we can finally get to some of the root causes of what we're dealing with.
Speaking of the metaphors in your book, I thought one of the best ones you made is when you wrote that race is the skin, caste is the bone. Yeah. And that really, I think, fused together how those principles, kind of work. And more importantly, I totally got succinctly why you don't use the word, racism necessarily in the books, because it can be a huge distraction. Although calling somebody a casteist doesn't really work, it doesn't sing off the tongue as well.
It doesn't roll off the tongue because we're not used to it. But I don't like labels anyway. I
Right.
don't feel. One of the points I'm making is I don't know where does it get us to call somebody something. I don't know have we resolved the underlying issue. That's what I generally don't. I don't generally do that myself. Again, but what other people do and how they engage and work through, how they process, I don't judge. I'm merely saying that for me. And I think that the word casteist is not a word that we're not used to the word caste to begin with, much less casteist. So it's all
Right.
kind of new language anyway.
Very true. You hit on a point about how we can't even get on the same page in terms of history. And I want to drill down on that. But first, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more from Sade, a.k.a. Isabel Wilkerson, in just a moment. I'm sure you probably saw this, and I wanted to make sure that I apologize to you. I don't care about the other idiots out there. So I got in trouble for getting a book review of your, it wasn't a review. That was not a tweet about your book got me in trouble, right? And I'm sure it probably came back to you at some point, because I actually discussed it on this podcast or whatever about what I was trying to say. As you know, Twitter is not often the place for nuance about it, right? So in Caste, you specifically compare the caste systems of India and Nazi Germany to bring home the point about how certain things are, there's connective tissue there. Nowhere in the book, so people should know, was Isabel Wilkerson saying what I said, okay, just so everyone knows, and so this doesn't come back on you, when I was merely making the point that we just have this inflated sense of our superiority in this country because we have all gotten drunk on the wine of American exceptionalism, right? That's what we've been told our whole life. We the leader of the free world, best country on earth. And as I tell people, I was like, those are affirmations, right? That's a little bit different than we know that this is to be true, but we say it with such truth and with such conviction because, as you said before the break, we're not even on the same page about what actually happened in American history. I'd like to delve into that a little bit further. Why is that? I could blame the educational system. We all could, right? But why is there such a concerted effort to whitewash the history in this country? I don't understand why simply telling the truth is so difficult about it. What are your thoughts about how our inability to do this with history has kind of led us to where we are right now?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to the founding creed of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, of the creed of equality, the belief, the desire to believe in equality, the desire to believe in democracy, the desire to believe that it's a just, fair world and country. The desire to believe in the essential, and the essential just nature of what the country believes it stands for. And I think that anything that goes against that, first of all, is hard to absorb because that's just how people have been raised and trained over the generations and the centuries. But I also think that looking at it historically, I think that we as a country don't spend enough time on understanding Reconstruction, the aftermath of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and then how Reconstruction ended. Because how Reconstruction ended is kind of what set in motion the ways that we perceive the country. And you know, at the end of the war, at the end of the Civil War, of course, the North prevailed on the battlefield, but it did not necessarily prevail in terms of the narrative. And because the North ended up retreating from the South in an effort to maintain the peace and to bring the South into the country as a whole, to reunite the country, there was a tremendous effort to reunite the country after the Civil War. And one of the casualties of that was, of course, the safety and security and standing of African Americans who were essentially abandoned, and the people who had been formerly enslaved. But also a casualty was how the entire war was perceived, how the stories were told, how the narrative sort of worked its way into how the country sees itself. And I don't know that there's been, that's the reason why we have these debates and these tensions over the emblems and symbols of the Confederacy, because the Confederacy was managed to really have a strong influence over the final narrative, the narrative that we all have inherited about what the country stands for, and you know what was called the lost cause was actually about. So we're not on the same page because we're not on the same page about what even happened then. A lot of people are not aware that, you know, when you talk about a civil rights movement, which civil rights movement are you speaking about? Because there was civil rights legislation of the 1860s. And then it took 100 years to have the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. So there's so much about our country's history that people don't know. And a lot of it, like I said, is going back, you know, many decades. And we're a country that's a young country, so we don't even we're thinking about the past. We're always looking forward. Like, we don't want to think about the past. We don't want to, that's in the past. It doesn't have to take long to say that's in the past. You know, that was 20 years ago, that's in the past. So we're not naturally, and we're not a country that actually thinks deeply, because it's a forward-thinking, you know, technology-driven, of the moment, looking forward kind of country. So there are lots of different reasons why, and those are some of them, I think.
Because we can say whatever, a lot can be said, and a lot has been written about the awfulness of the Nazi regime. But I tell you what happens when you go to Germany, you don't see statues of Nazis nowhere. No. That's not a thing, all right? But here, as I made the point about John Lewis, who unfortunately passed and was an icon and a hero, I mean, he walked the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I encourage people, look up who Edmund Pettus was. He has a bridge. That's all I gotta say. And so that to me is a perfect sort of depiction of what you were talking about, and not being on the same page, and these lies that we constantly kind of tell ourselves. 2042 will be the first year that whites will no longer be the majority in this country. What impact do you think this could have on our caste system?
Yeah, so, you know, the projections were announced by the census back in 2008, and it did get attention at the time, got a lot of attention at the time, and filtered through, you know, talk radio and, you know, newscasts and that sort of thing. And I think that it was a jarring moment for many people to even begin to contemplate a distribution of the population that would be different than anyone has ever known. You know, no time in the history of the country has there been anything other than the majority that we've known it to be, you know, since the founding. And since I have to adjust that by saying, of course, the country was taken from indigenous people who were the majority at the time that the colonists first arrived. But from the time that the United States was created as a country on its own, this has been the majority all this time. And so the idea of there being some kind of inversion of what everyone has been accustomed to raises questions of existential fears about what will happen. What does that mean? What what does that mean for a country that has prided itself on majority rule? What happens when the historic majority is no longer the majority, assuming that these projections hold? Because there are, that these are projections that could be affected by any number of policies as well. But what happens when that occurs? And one of the things that I think that the reason why people feel fearful is because there's never been a time when that has been even contemplated. That's never, ever had to be the case. And, our country has been one that has experienced so much segregation, even in the North. In fact, in the North, segregation is more pronounced. It's called hyper-segregation in the North, that many, many people in the historic majority have not been in circumstances logistically where they've had to even be around people who are not in the majority. One could build one's entire life without really being around people other than yourself. So it raises all kinds of questions about just just everyday logistics, to also issues of what happens with majority rule. There are all kinds of questions that are raised by that. But I would also say that that the fears from a caste perspective, in terms of history, may not be as it may be, and it may be that people are worrying about something, are concerned about something that does not have to happen in the ways that they fear it might, and that doesn't mean for good or for ill. And that's because we have the example of South Africa, where there's a minority of people. The powerful minority actually is white, and they have been in the minority for the duration of that country's history. And they have been in power the entire time. Even now, while there may not be the same level of political power in some ways from a practical standpoint, the economic power and thus the influence has remained in the hands of the minority that's always been in power. And so there are many different ways that this could play out. And this is a moment where the country can begin thinking about what it wants to be. What kind of country does America want to be? Does it want to be an inclusive, open-minded, embracing country that builds on the strengths of all of its people? Or does it want to regress into further fear and division? This is a moment of the decision-making about what the country will be. And so 2042 is the projected date. Sometimes it gets pushed back based upon what the projections might be, but it's within the next few decades that this would be a demographic change in our country.
Is it fair or too much hyperbole to say that what we're seeing now is a desperate grasp of the ruling class to maintain that power by many of the, when you look at something like voter suppression and all these other things that are happening politically? I mean, is it fair to read it that way, that this is a last Hail Mary attempt to make sure that power stays securely in the ruling class's hands?
From a historic perspective, that is what has happened in the past, where, people will do whatever they can to maintain the hierarchy as they've known it. And that's I think that's what we're seeing.
Were you, as I mentioned, you compared India's caste system, which is the oldest in the world, is that correct? Okay.
The oldest surviving.
The oldest surviving caste system. So you compared theirs, and you also compared that to Nazi Germany. Their caste system, why did you think, because we know what an explosive, sometimes we make any comparison or any parallels to Nazi Germany, like that can get people's attention for sure. Why did you choose Germany during that time to make those parallels with the United States in terms of comparing the caste system?
Well, let me clarify that I did not start out looking at Germany. I started out looking at India because India was the most obvious place to try to better understand how hierarchy and caste works. It was an obvious place to go. It's the most recognizable caste system in the world. And that was what I was focusing on for the most part, and knew that that was going to be important to truly understand that. And then Charlottesville happened. And that was, at Charlottesville, we saw the protesters who were, carrying and parading the paraphernalia and symbols of both the Confederacy and of Nazi Germany. The protesters merged those two cultures. The protesters merged those two hierarchies. The protesters merged those two regimes, you might say, those two ways of managing hierarchy. And so the symbolism occurred there with the protesters. It was not. I was not the one even, necessarily looking at that until I saw that they saw a connection themselves between Nazi Germany and the Confederacy, and made it very clear that they did. And so that got my attention to begin to look at Germany in the beginning, not so much about the Nazis per se, but how Germany had been dealing with its history, how it had reckoned with and atoned for that history in the decades after World War II. And I, once I got to look at it, to your point about the fact that there are no statues to any of them whatsoever. So if protesters in Charlottesville made the comparison themselves between these two cultures, and in one there are symbols. In fact, the Charlottesville was about the protest to keep that symbol, keep that monument to the statue of Robert E. Lee intact. But in Germany, there are no equivalents to the Robert E. Lee statue. In fact, it's quite the opposite. All of the headquarters and locations that were connected to the Nazis have been converted into places of education, of museums, and places that are memorials to those who suffered and were victims of that regime. And so this was a complete opposite of how the United States had dealt with its history, or particularly the South in particular dealt with its history. And so, but I had no idea, once I got there, I had no idea that it went so much further than that in fact, there was this connection between the United States and Nazi Germany in ways that I would not have imagined, wasn't looking for. And the deeper I started to research it, I discovered that there was, for example, there were German eugenicists who actually were consulting with American eugenicists in the years leading up to the Nazi takeover. That American eugenicists had these books that they wrote and that were big sellers in Germany in the years leading up to the Third Reich. And I have to emphasize over and over again, that the Nazis needed no one to teach them how to hate. They did not need anyone to show them how to hate. They had down pat. With or without America, they knew how to hate. But what they did was they actually sent researchers to the United States to study the Jim Crow laws and laws in other states that restricted who could marry whom. They studied the anti-miscegenation laws, and there were anti-miscegenation laws in 41 other 50 states at some point in our country's history. And the most recent one of them was not overturned until the year 2000 in the state of Alabama.
That blew my mind. Alabama, that blew my mind.
And even in that referendum, even in that vote, 40% of the voters said they wanted to keep that law on the books. 40%. So this is not ancient history. But in any case, the Nazis sent researchers to the United States to study these laws. They sent researchers to study the ways that the South in particular had subjugated African Americans, in other ways, the segregation laws and the definitions of who was seen as Black and who was seen as white, or seen as they had the language of that era is, is very regressive. They talk about words that we don't use now to describe people who might be of Asian descent and how to define people of Asian descent. And it was very, each state and jurisdiction had its own definition. And so they actually sent people, the Nazis sent researchers to study the ways that the United States had delineated and categorized its people by race, and the laws to enforce that categorization as they were debating what would ultimately become the Nuremberg laws.
And they thought that some of the laws that we had, some of the Jim Crow laws, were actually too harsh. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there were some things that, as they were debating, they found it hard to believe. Some of them, they said that they didn't believe that Americans actually enforced these laws. The laws about some of the intermarriage laws, they felt that they probably did not. They were debating among themselves and probably thinking the Americans probably did not enforce some of these laws. That was not true. Actually, they were very vigorously enforced. But one of the things that they had the hardest time with is the idea of the one-drop rule. That was basically a standard in many southern states. And that was that one drop of African blood made a person Black. And that you could, that no matter what your background was, no matter what you looked like, just the awareness, just the discovery of a single Black ancestor going back many, many generations, the discovery of one, could stigmatize a person and lead to their being categorized as Black in the American context. And that was one thing. That was something that the Nazis did not accept.
So I'm from.
They did.
Okay. So I'm from Detroit, and so I grew up my whole life hearing about Henry Ford, right? Because Henry Ford and the Ford family is the most prominent family maybe in Michigan's history, right? All I knew is inventor of the automobile, the usual stuff about the Ford family. I did not find out until the earlier part of this year how much Adolf Hitler loved Henry Ford. Did not know this at all. And I was like, wait, what? I was unaware that Henry Ford owned a newspaper. I think it's called the Dearborn Independent, if I'm not mistaken, of which he had very anti-Semitic articles written about Jews and all kind of racist things that racist reports that he had in his newspaper. I had no idea that Henry Ford was a flaming racist. All right. And so finding out that piece of it, it got to your point about how much Hitler sort of admired the United States. Because when you think about it, it is quite fascinating that despite what our racial history is and slavery and Jim Crow and all these things, how highly regarded. I mean, we had our own system of apartheid, and I'm old enough to remember when we basically banned South Africa from existence from doing the same shit we used to do all the time. So it's really quite amazing how America has been able to have the greatest PR campaign in the world. How is it from a historical standpoint that were other parts of the world or other countries just unaware of what was happening in our country? Like, why were we able to still maintain such good standing in the world when other countries who practice the same thing were not?
Well, one of the things is that there are not actually a lot of countries there are not a lot of countries that have such a wide range of what we call multiracial population. And that's a problematic word too, because how do you define race? I mean, there are many countries that have multiple ethnicities, and those ethnicities can be a cause for tremendous strife, as we know around the world. But, if you think about it, I mean, it's called the New World for a reason, in that for the first time in human history, you have people from, all corners of the planet, all converging, some by choice, some by force, to make a new country. And in the process of doing that, of course, the people who are coming in from who were kidnapped and brought to the United States from Africa were from the very beginning placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy, in a new hierarchy that had not needed to exist before, but was created and evolved on the soil. And so the process of that meant dehumanization of the people to justify their enslavement. It meant so many, and there's so much in the book, there's so many ways that that people of African descent who were enslaved were kept in a fixed place. And so because of that, and it went on for so long, and it was also happening on, on isolated plantations. Like many of the things that were happening to African Americans it was a totally different world from where we can see anything in any moment now. It was so much easier throughout most of American history to keep so much of what we now know, in the shadows, because there would not be a way to have made this known. When the abolitionists came and they started to look at this and to work at unveiling and to uncovering what was happening, they had to make great strides to study and to send people down. What I'm trying to get at is that much of it would not have been easily knowable unless you were really searching for it. One. And then two, because of the subordinated, subjugated condition that people of African descent were forced into by enslavement, then they also were seen as what they were forced to be. So even visitors would have also been seeing people of African descent who were enslaved to begin to see them as only fit for what they were forced to do. Enslavement lasted for 246 years. That's 12 generations of people forced into enslavement. And so that means that it went on for so long that many, many visitors might have just seen this is the way that it is. This is what the people they can do, nothing more than this is all that they're fit for. So they also could fall very easily into the assumptions about African American, about people of African descent. And then, of course, over time, these stereotypes and assumptions were then exported to the rest of the world, so that people around the world also began to also see the stereotypes and assumptions about people of African descent. So because people were seen as being stereotyped and in a subordinated position, then they were seen as a position that they were forced to be in. And so it's so where was the intervention going to come from to help people who were in so long? And I think that it became part of a sense of, this is just the laws of nature. This is what happens. So that there would not have been an intervention in the ways that, there's so many works of science fiction in which we can almost imagine what would happen if someone had come in and recognized and helped, intervened on the behalf of people who were enslaved. But in any case, where was the intervention going to come from? And then also one other thing is that because the country was and has been so economically successful, as a result, of course, of enslavement, having a huge part in the economic, of course, thinking about the work of the historian Edward Baptist, who lays out the exact economic connections between and dependence in some ways of the country on enslavement for its economic advancement. So because of its success, people admire success, and it's successful. It has been and continues to be an economically successful country, and so all those things combine to mean that there may be people who are willing to overlook, if they know at all, some of the history. That, again, I have to emphasize that most people don't know at all. And I'd like to hold out benefit of the doubt to people. I really hold out benefit of the doubt. If you do not know, you can't be expected to know. But once you know, then the responsibility falls upon anyone to then adjust themselves and act accordingly once they know. But most people, I mean, like I said, when the War of the Sons came out, many, many people who lived through this era said, I had no idea. And I have to take them at the word. They didn't know because it's not taught. People who were enduring this were not talking about it. And so people just did not know. So if the people are not, the people who had been suffering and enduring this were not speaking, and those who were in a position to have control over, what history did get out to the world were not recognizing it, then it wasn't known.
Mm. You also, write in Caste that the caste system is just as harmful for white people as it is for Black people. Why do you think that is?
I would say it's certainly harmful in different ways, of course.
Yeah. I don't want to equalize them necessarily.
Yeah, right.
Yes, that's a perfect way to say that.
Yeah.
Thank you for cleaning that up.
There's so many ways. Where should I start? One way is that a caste system, by keeping people apart, means that you have these groups who were not even permitted to even show goodwill to one another, and you could be punished for crossing caste boundaries, whatever they may be, because caste is about, if it's about nothing, if it's about anything, it's about boundaries, keeping those boundaries strong, the walls secure that keep people apart. And so by having people kept apart for so long, not even intermarriage is one way that people can have a greater stake in one another. I'm not saying that this is not a judgment on intermarriage or not. It's just saying that if you're forbidden to make family across these caste lines, then you have no vested interest in people who you are told are not like yourself. You have no stake in the well-being of people who you are told are not like yourself. You have no way of knowing the truth of the experience, authentic experience of people who you are told are not like you. You do not get to know people who are you're told are not like you. You may be losing out on some of the best friendships and connections that you could ever have. And many people who have been in the army and been on the front lines with people who were of different backgrounds, different races, will come back and say, this person saved my life, and if it hadn't been for that person, they can give testimony to the beauty of people who they've been told are different from themselves. So on a spiritual soul level, people are being deprived of the opportunity to get to know people who they might otherwise have had the most amazing and incredible interactions and friendships with. On another level, because people are so segregated in a caste system, then that means that people, because they don't have a stake in the well-being of other people, they then may even support policies that hurt even themselves because they are so concerned about or so maybe focused on, sadly, on making sure that people that they feel are unworthy, undeserving, do not get or presume in their view, take what they would not be actually deserving of, and then thus denying themselves of things. Many of the policies that can help working class people may be rejected because there's a fear that people who are quote unquote undeserving might have the chance to take advantage of it too. And so you end up being falsely divided on the basis of mythology, not looking at oneself and others in one's own country as part of a same community, and then being distanced from one's own humanity, because when you dehumanize other people, then you are losing out. You are also dehumanizing yourself.
Before we get to a couple of quick hit fun questions, because I did notice in my deep research of Isabel Wilkerson, you are commonly asked to solve all of our problems of race and inequality. So I figured somebody should ask this woman something fun at some point, right? But before I get to the fun stuff, finally, I want to ask you, I feel like this is a different conversation about inequality and institutional racism and all those other things that we're having now than I can remember ever having in our life, but I don't want to be fooled into thinking that. What's your perspective about how we're talking about race and class and all these things now versus maybe at other historical turning points in our history?
That is a really good question. I think that, of course, many of the things that we're seeing, from all of the names, the metronome of names that we all now know, going back to Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Jonathan Farrell and so many names, Sandra Bland, all these names, Breonna Taylor. These things have been happening for generations. But because we now have, visible witness from the technology that allows all of us to see often in, sometimes almost in real time, as occurred with Philando Castile. The brutalization that is being, suffered by people who had been assigned from the very beginning to the bottom of a hierarchy, to the subordinated caste in our country. Because now people can see this. I think and they're now responding in ways that they might not have before, because it's so easy to dismiss something if you are not affected by it yourself. If you yourself are not affected by it, if you do not know anyone is affected by it, again, that's the consequence of all the segregation that we still live with. If you have not had to deal with this personally, it's so, if as you move about in the world, you're treated completely differently, you don't even realize you're being treated completely differently, then you may not be even, your first response would be to disbelieve what never happens to you. And so I'm speaking about the people in the majority, I'm speaking about what would be called the dominant caste. And so once everyone is able to see, that's like I'm saying about getting on the same page about what's happened in our country, our history. People can see these things, and for the most part, the vast majority of people will be on the same page about the horrors of what they're seeing there before their eyes in these viral videos. And I think that is what has awakened people. I feel that we're on the cusp of an awakening. And I, from a historic perspective, I am always cautious, because it's not one thing that led to the civil rights, revolution. And it took everything. And and then even once we had the progress of the civil rights era, we then saw regression. So it's an ongoing continuum, as I've said. And I would say that this is a time of hopefulness, because people of many different backgrounds are recognizing how wrong so much of this is and are responding. At the same time, if people do not remain vigilant, I describe in this book that this is, the caste is like a pathogen, it's like a virus. And, viruses live on the planet. They are a part of our ecosystem. And the only protection really is vigilance to it. So you can never get comfortable. You can never assume that something is taken care of. I describe it as an old house, because an old house old houses always need work, and you can never declare the work over. And so because an old house always requires work, and our country is an old house, then it would not be wise to assume that we just will have this one legislation. We will have this one, policy. We will have, or this collection of policies that will take care of everything. It's not one thing. It's everything. And also, caste is something that is an unseen. It's like it's an unseen virus, and so that means that we have to constantly be aware that it could resurface at any time in some new configuration. It can mutate, as viruses do, and so I am cautiously hopeful, because this seems to be a time where we're on the cusp of an awakening. But I'm also aware that the history is long and the history is deep, and it's not one thing, but it takes everything in order to make true substantive change.
It reminds me of something my former personal trainer of mine used to say, because, when you start working out and you want to maybe lose weight or get healthier, you want it to happen really fast, right? And she would be like, okay, so it took you 10 years to put on this weight, but you want it off in 3 weeks. Like, that doesn't add up, right? So it took us hundreds of years to get to this point to suggest that, even the most sweeping New Deal type of legislation would probably still require a lot of work to undo the damage that has been done. As I mentioned, I got fun questions, very quick hit. It's a game, Isabel, I like to play with all my guests here on Jemele Hill is Unbothered. It's called This or That. I'm gonna give you two choices. Yes. don't try to academic your way out of these choices either. Like, I'm gonna give you two choices and you must pick one. That's the way it goes. She's already looking at me like I'm annoyed. So you have to do this. So I know that you're a big fan, of course, who isn't a big fan of James Baldwin, right? So
right.
Go Tell It on the Mountain, or If Beale Street Could Talk.
Beale Street.
I'm actually surprised that you said that. All right. You did it, but you did that with conviction. So see, I knew that you were ready. Richard Wright or Zora Neale Hurston?
I have to say Wright, I just, because of Warmth of the Suns, what can I say? I have to.
Yeah.
It's tough. I mean, these questions are hard, but I got the title for my first book from Richard Wright. So, I mean, his work, inspired the title. So I have to go with that.
We were talking earlier about audiobooks. I recently, I forgot, I did do another audiobook in between yours. It was Their Eyes Were Watching God. Phenomenal. Yeah. Ruby Dee does it. It's unbelievable. Yeah, it's great. Like, so I'm just like, oh man, actors out there, let me tell you, y'all got a good additional stream of income if you start doing these audiobooks.
And that's why I don't read mine. I mean, there are people who can do an awesome, phenomenal job, and that's what they do. And that's why I honor them.
Yeah. Getting a 9 out of 10 from Room Rater. For people who don't know, Room Rater is this wonderful Twitter feed. Because we're all in COVID and we're all doing things from home, they rate what your backdrop looks like on every television appearance, whatever it may be. And Isabel got a 9 out of 10 from Room Rater. Was that honor that was better than being picked for Oprah's Book Club? Which one?
That is so unfair because, both of them are really, really tough. Obviously, I have to say Oprah.
But that Room Rater one, look, I got a 10 out of 10, so I was like, yes.
And it was partly because I didn't get a 10.
You're right. Had they given you the 10, it might have been above Oprah. Finally, you're a proud Howard graduate. You worked on the Howard newspaper, correct? You were an editor?
The Hilltop, yeah.
The Hilltop, right. So when it comes to Howard alums, Kamala Harris or Puffy?
I will say Kamala Harris.
Okay, that was reluctant. I saw hesitation. Part of you wanted to say Puffy. No, I know you did.
No, I will say Kamala Harris. I am going to support a Sister Bison.
Yes, a Sister Bison. And I this is no shade, but I don't know if Puffy actually graduated from Howard. He went to Howard.
See, and there's another thing. Yeah.
There it is. Yep. See, sometimes you got to split hairs in these very tough and difficult choices. I just want to thank you so much, Isabel, for spending this time with me. I know we met a long time ago. I believe we did a panel together at ESPN.
We did.
Yeah, we did, yes. Because I still have that photo.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we did it a long time ago when I was at ESPN for Outside the Lines. It was something Black History Month related, I believe they were doing at the time.
Yes.
Yeah. So I know it does feel like 20 lifetimes ago, but nevertheless, I'm so glad that you were able to spend this time with me. This is truly an honor. I cannot even describe what this means to me, just on a personal level, with you being a practicing journalist. I know you're in a different form now, like writing these books, but as a journalist and just as a historian and a scholar, the books you have written have like just changed generations. So I cannot implore all of you listening enough. You need to read Warmth of Other Suns first, right? Then get to graduate the Caste. And I promise you, it will change your entire perspective about what you thought about how race and class and caste work in this country. So read it. Right now, as we're taping this podcast, I think it's in the top 5 of nonfiction on the New York Times bestseller list. It was number 4 the last time I checked. It may be higher now. Who knows? We need to make it number 1. Because I believe awful ass Sean Hannity's book is there. I was like, God, he's a terrible person. But I think it's at you.
Yeah, I think it's.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sorry. All right. Got you. So anyway, Isabel's getting out of here. One more segment, guys. You know what's coming up next. Fuck it. I'm bothered. All right. Isabel, thank you so much for being here. This was such a treat. It really was.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.